This video is part of the Finance Fundamentals TVM Crash Course series. In this lesson, numbered A8, you need to understand periodicity. You don't necessarily have to break away from this video to first watch the other episodes in the crash course. But if you haven't already seen the lessons on how to use your financial calculator, why you really do need to draw the timeline, and other foundational topics, you will find them in the TVM Crash Course playlist on the Finance Fundamentals channel. See the links in the description for details. Back to periodicity, which we define as follows. Periodicity refers to the regular intervals at which the discount rate is compounded. Therefore, periodicity is determined on the basis of compounding frequency, not the cash flow frequency. I made that emphasis because this is a very common source of error in my long experience teaching university students of finance. There are many situations where compounding periods and cash flows happen to occur at the same frequency, but these are just coincidental examples of lucky circumstance, and they are not a general rule of finance. So don't fall into the trap of looking at the cash flow pattern when you are in fact searching for your rate periodicity. It is standard practice in finance that rates are communicated in annual terms, even when the compounding frequency is something other than 1 year. These are called stated annual rates. There are always two parts to a stated annual rate: the rate itself and the compounding frequency. To avoid mistakes involving periodicity, you need to align the frequency of compounding with the periodic interest rate and the total number of periods. With only one exception, and I'll get back to that shortly, you cannot directly use a stated rate in any TVM calculation without first adjusting it. Furthermore, you cannot use a simplistic count of years. The period count also needs to be adjusted. So, an instrument that matures in 4 years might have a stated annual rate of 10% compounded semi-annually, which means every 6 months or twice a year. TVM calculations for such an instrument will then use a discount rate per 6-month period of 5%, calculated as the annual rate of 10% divided by 2, and the period count will be 8, which is 4 years times 2. Now you might like to try an example. If you buy a house and you finance it with a 20-year mortgage loan at a stated annual rate of 9% compounded monthly, what are the discount rate and period count inputs for your calculation of your repayments? You may want to pause the video while you decide on your answer. For the rate, you would need to use 9% divided by 12, which is 0.75% per month, and your period count would be 20 times 12, which is 240 months. Here are some of the most common periodicities in finance. If the stated annual rate is compounded daily, the periodicity is 365, or in some circumstances, a 360-day assumption is applied. Let's proceed with the 365-day assumption. N for your TVM calculations would be the number of years times 365, so it would be a rather large number. The discount rate would need to be a per day rate calculated as the annual rate divided by 365. Here we would have a rather small number. Very common in personal finance situations is a stated annual rate compounded monthly, which means obviously that the periodicity is 12. In these cases, N the period count is calculated as years times 12, and the rate per period, which is also the rate per month, would be the annual rate divided by 12. This particular rate is widely referred to as the prime rate. A quarterly rate would of course have a periodicity of 4, and the years would be multiplied by 4 and the rate would be divided by 4. I make a comment there in the table that, and this is an error that I have seen from time to time, and it's fully understandable under the stress of exam conditions, that regrettably I see a student take a quarterly rate and assume that the periodicity number is 3, which it's understandable. As I say, that comes from the fact that there are 3 months in a quarter. But of course, the periodicity is 4 because there are 4 quarters in a year. The stated annual rate compounded semi-annually has a special name in the fixed income markets. It is sometimes called the bond equivalent yield, alternatively the bond basis yield. This is an example of a stated annual rate compounded semi-annually, and the number of years would be multiplied by 2 to get you to the correct period count, and the rate would be divided by 2. Lastly, in that table, we have the only stated annual rate that does not require any adjustment at all, and that is the stated annual rate compounded annually. This has another name. It is also known as the effective annual rate, or EAR, and in this situation, as I've just mentioned, it's the only one in which you would simplistically, with your brain in neutral, mark off your timeline in years and use the annual rate supplied to you. Before we leave this table and move on to the rest of the video, I think I should just make the point that the table only has discrete compounding frequencies in which compounding occurs at specific intervals. There is a discussion of continuous compounding later on in the crash course. So, can we say with confidence that if you follow the guidance I've just given, you will be able to deal correctly with any given exam question situation? Unfortunately, I can't promise to keep you safe from error every time. There are some situations where you may find yourself scratching your head about compounding frequency issues, even though you are well on top of your periodicity game. I'll divide these situations into 2 categories. Firstly, issues that are just well-established financial practice and which should not be a cause for concern as long as you know about them. In this category, we have equity returns. R subscript E is often supplied in an exam as an unlabeled percentage rate, with no indication of whether it is annual or what the compounding frequency is. 2 points here. Firstly, rates are almost always annual even when they are not explicitly labeled as such, because this is simply conventional practice in finance. Secondly, and with reference to returns on equity, these are generally treated as effective annual rates. So you should not really expect to see R sub E expressed in the stated annual compounded annually language that we have been using here. Instead, you will just see the percentage rate, full stop. WACC, the weighted average cost of capital, is generally treated in the same way as R subscript E, as an effective annual rate, without further need for specification. But there is a detail in the calculation of WACC that sometimes causes minor controversy. What I'm getting at here is that WACC is a combination of equity and debt rates. As we have just seen, the equity rate has an assumed periodicity of 1, but the debt rate, especially when there are corporate bonds involved, might be on a bond equivalent yield basis and therefore have a periodicity of 2. Does this mismatch mean that the debt rate has to be converted before you combine it with the equity rate? I would argue that this is not necessary. especially when you keep your eye on the big picture, which is that WACC is really only a broad brush estimate of a fundamentally unknowable future. The precision added by converting the bond yield from a BEY to an EAR is therefore, in my opinion anyway, spurious and a waste of time. The second source of uncertainty about compounding frequency is unfortunate because it is avoidable and entirely the result of examiner negligence. I will be blunt here. I hope you never have a professor or course presenter who does the stuff I'm about to describe. But just in case, there are some examiner mistakes that you might face at some point. My main example of examiner sloppiness is when you are hit with a market yield or a YTM on a bond with no indication of what the compounding frequency of that particular bond is. For example, you read this in your exam. A quarterly pay 10% bond has a yield to maturity of 9.2%. Is that 9.2% compounded semi-annually, as is very common in the fixed income markets? Or is it compounded quarterly because this bond is a quarterly pay instrument? My advice to you as you engage in any pushback with an examiner who has wrongly graded you as incorrect in these situations, it is reasonable to assume in such cases that the unstated rate periodicity aligns with the coupon frequency. And lastly for this video, you need to follow the conventions of your course presenter or examining institution. I think it would be futile for you to get all litigious about these matters, even when you know that you are right and they are wrong. So just grit your teeth about having to use the wrong rate and harvest the points you need to get the credential you are after. Then you can go off into your professional career doing the right thing, not what you were taught by misguided educators. If you got some benefit from this video, I would really appreciate it if you considered subscribing to the channel, or maybe even hitting that like button. One possible benefit of subscribing is that you can stay up to date about when I release the free course materials and question bank for the TVM crash course. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.